We're the sort of species that can look at what's going on out there amongst the other species and try, at least when we feel it's safe, to adjust things for the ethically better.
Yes, that's exactly right. I don't think there's anything surprising or strange or unusual about this idea. It's something that a lot of people just do without thinking when they have the opportunity.
Mm.
As I said very early on in the interview, I grew up out in the country in the rural South, and I came on wounded animals at different times. And as a child, I would, even though I was a hunter, I would bring the wounded animals home and try to heal them and let them go free again. Or sometimes our dogs would injure an animal, and we'd try to rescue the wild animal from the dog and heal the wild animal and let it go. We did this with possums and raccoons and all kinds of animals. This is not foreign to other people. If you see an animal that's in pain or distress and there's something you can do to ameliorate the situation, many people feel that it's the right thing to do that.
And so the picture you're suggesting in the article is that if we see not just individual animals, but a pattern of suffering being caused by predators, in this case, across the animal kingdom, and we have the resources, we should do one of two things. We should either phase out the carnivores altogether, maybe keeping a few around if need be in a kind of the way we keep anthrax around or keep species that have disappeared around, at least insofar as we can. Or we could, and maybe this is your preferred option, we could, once we have the technological ability and feel it's very safe, we could modify their genetic structure such that they become like panda bears, no longer omnivores or carnivores, but rather herbivores. So they change their diet and no longer prey on one another.
Yeah, this seems to me to be something that ideally we should be striving for. We're nowhere near being able to do this kind of thing with confidence at present. And this is one of the things that I should make clear, that I don't think that we should go out and start trying to eliminate predators right now by any means.
Yeah.
Because of the possibility that this would result in even greater suffering among animals in the wild than we have at the moment. Now, there's an obvious problem that I called attention to briefly in the piece that you've asked the students to read, and that is that if you remove predators from a certain ecosystem, then the herbivore populations will naturally expand, and they'll have to find food to eat, but eventually they may begin to run out of the food, and you'll have large-scale starvation among these animals, or if they're malnourished, they're going to begin suffering more from disease, and a slow death from malnutrition, starvation, or disease is probably a lot worse than a quick death in the jaws of a predator. So the aim is to reduce suffering among animals in the wild, and if we are to try to do this, we have to make sure that we can be confident of succeeding and not do something that's totally counterproductive that would actually make things worse.
A couple of questions about the view.
Okay.
First, I'm just curious what your sense of the response was, especially to the New York Times piece, and whether you thought that any good objections came up, you know, in the discussion area on the New York Times website or in conversations with people subsequent to that. There was a lot of ranting, I noticed, but
Yeah, I'll have to say I was very surprised by the response that I received to that article. A couple of months earlier, Peter Singer had written an article for the same New York Times blog in which he considered the question whether it would be a good idea if the human species were to go extinct. And he took that seriously and discussed the views of some philosophers who have argued that, in fact, that would be a good thing.
Right.
He came out in favor of the conclusion that the continuation of the human species would be a good thing. Um, but I noticed that the discussion following that piece was nowhere near as kind of virulent and angry as the discussion following my piece was. And I'm not quite sure why that is. I would have thought that taking seriously the idea that it would be a good thing to eliminate human beings would be more provocative than the idea that it would be a good thing to minimize suffering among animals, perhaps by diminishing or eliminating carnivore populations.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, so I wonder if it's the concern people have about anthropocentrism or about our meddling in other parts of nature in a way that suggests a kind of hubris that sets people off, whereas when we're talking about kind of killing ourselves off, then there's a kind of humility to it that people find to be curious and okay somehow.
yeah, I suppose there's some plausibility to that, though I don't think the suggestions about bringing about human extinction were premised on the idea that everyone would consent to
Ah,
die. So it's hard to imagine a very benign scenario for bringing about human extinction. It
right.
looks like it's going to have to be a form of genocide and not just everyone agreeing, yeah, it's having individuals like me around is just a bad thing.
Right.
But I think you're right, yeah. And it may well be that quite a few of the people who were writing in indignantly in response to my article were environmentalists and ecologists whose thinking about these matters was informed by a knowledge of the long history of major human interventions in the natural world, many of which have been fairly catastrophic and almost all of which have been motivated by human self-interest rather than a real concern for animals, for example.